Every day, American policymakers make decisions based on mathematical models that treat human beings like particles in physics. They predict consumer behavior with equations, measure aggregate demand as if it were temperature, and wonder why their stimulus packages produce the opposite of their intended effects. What they refuse to acknowledge is that human action cannot be reduced to mathematical formulas because humans act purposefully, not mechanically. For decades in Vienna, and later during my years teaching at New York University, I developed what I call praxeology, the logic of human action, as the only scientific method capable of understanding economic phenomena. Unlike the false empiricism that dominates American universities today, praxeology begins with the undeniable fact that humans act purposefully to achieve their goals. From this simple axiom, we can deduce the entire science of economics with mathematical precision, but without the mathematical delusion. Today, I'll demonstrate why praxeology is not just another economic theory, but the foundation of all genuine social science. Chapter 1: The Fundamental Axiom of Human Action. The starting point of all economic science is an axiom so obvious that even its denial confirms its truth: humans act. When someone argues against this statement, they are acting purposefully to convince others of their position. This is what I call the praxeological axiom, the undeniable foundation from which all economic knowledge derives. But what does it mean to act? Action implies consciousness, purpose, and choice. When you decide to buy coffee instead of tea, you're not responding to mathematical stimuli like a laboratory rat. You're making a conscious choice based on your subjective valuation at that specific moment, considering your available means to achieve your preferred ends. This is fundamentally different from the mechanistic behavior that Keynesian economists try to model with their aggregate functions and elasticity coefficients. Consider how American economic policies consistently fail because they ignore this basic truth. Federal Reserve officials measure consumer confidence through surveys, then adjust interest rates as if human preferences were thermostatic controls. They assume that lowering rates will automatically increase investment, as if entrepreneurs were machines programmed to borrow whenever money becomes cheaper. But praxeology reveals why this mechanistic thinking fails. Entrepreneurs don't just respond to interest rates, they interpret the entire market situation, assess profit opportunities, and make conscious decisions about uncertain futures. The beauty of the praxeological method is its absolute certainty. Unlike empirical sciences that deal with probabilities, praxeology provides apodictic knowledge that cannot be otherwise. We know with absolute certainty that when someone acts, they prefer their chosen course of action to all available alternatives at that moment. This isn't a hypothesis to be tested, it's a logical truth derived from the nature of action itself. This certainty distinguishes Austrian economics from the false precision of mathematical economics. American graduate schools teach students to build elaborate econometric models, pretending that human behavior follows the same laws as planetary motion. But unlike planets, humans learn, adapt, and change their behavior based on past experiences. No mathematical formula can capture the creative uncertainty of entrepreneurial action or predict how individuals will respond to new situations. When I developed these insights during the socialist calculation debate of the 1920s, I wasn't creating another theory to compete in the marketplace of ideas. I was identifying the logical structure that underlies all economic phenomena. Socialism fails not because of empirical evidence, though the evidence is overwhelming, but because central planners cannot access the subjective valuations that drive all economic calculation. This is a logical impossibility, not a practical difficulty that better computers might solve. The implications for American economic policy are profound. Every government intervention assumes that bureaucrats can substitute their judgments for the voluntary choices of millions of acting individuals. But praxeology demonstrates that economic value exists only in the subjective minds of acting persons. No external observer can measure or compare these subjective valuations, making all forms of central economic planning scientifically impossible. Chapter 2: Why Mathematical Economics is Pseudoscience. The greatest intellectual fraud perpetrated in American universities is the pretense that economics can be made scientific by clothing it in mathematical formulas. This mathematical formalism has transformed economics from a logical science into an elaborate form of intellectual astrology, generating precise predictions that consistently fail to match reality. Mathematics deals with quantitative relationships between constant units. In physics, we can measure the relationship between force, mass, and acceleration because these are objective, measurable quantities that maintain constant relationships. But human action deals with subjective valuations that exist only in the minds of acting individuals and cannot be measured from the outside. When a Keynesian economist constructs a consumption function claiming that consumption equals some percentage of income, they're committing a fundamental category error. They're treating subjective human preferences as if they were objective physical constants. But my income doesn't determine my consumption. My subjective valuation of present versus future goods determines both my consumption and my savings decisions. Consider the absurdity of aggregate demand, one of the most cherished concepts in American macroeconomic policy. Federal Reserve officials and Treasury economists speak of measuring and manipulating aggregate demand as if it were a real entity that could be increased by government spending or lowered through tax increases. But praxeology reveals that demand is always individual and subjective. There is no such thing as aggregate demand, only the countless individual demands of acting persons, each based on their unique circumstances and subjective valuations. This mathematical delusion has practical consequences that harm American prosperity. When the Federal Reserve lowers interest rates to stimulate demand, they're operating on the false assumption that lower rates automatically translate into higher investment and consumption. But interest rates are prices that coordinate the subjective time preferences of savers and investors. When central bankers manipulate these prices, they're destroying the very information system that allows markets to coordinate economic activity. The empirical pretensions of mathematical economics are equally fraudulent. American economists spend vast resources collecting statistical data and running regression analyses, claiming to test economic theories the way physicists test natural laws. But human action takes place in historical time, where conditions are never repeated. Unlike controlled laboratory experiments, historical data reflects the complex interaction of countless variables that cannot be isolated or held constant. Moreover, statistical correlations reveal nothing about causal relationships in human action. If we observe that employment often increases following government spending programs, mathematical economists conclude that government spending causes employment. But praxeology demonstrates that this correlation might reflect entirely different causal chains. Perhaps employment increased despite government spending, or because entrepreneurs found ways to work around government obstacles. The Austrian method provides genuine scientific knowledge through logical deduction from the axiom of human action. We don't need statistical verification to know that price controls create shortages, because this conclusion follows logically from the nature of human action and market prices. When governments impose maximum prices below market levels, the quantity demanded at that price exceeds the quantity suppliers are willing to provide, not because we've observed this empirically, but because it follows logically from how humans act when faced with artificially constrained choices. This logical certainty makes Austrian economics genuinely scientific in a way that mathematical economics can never be. While Keynesian economists constantly revise their models when predictions fail, praxeological insights remain valid because they're based on the unchanging logical structure of human action itself. American economic education needs to abandon its mathematical pretensions and return to the logical rigor of praxeological analysis. Only then can we develop genuine understanding of economic phenomena and create policies based on how humans actually behave, rather than how mathematical models assume they should behave. Chapter 3: The Impossibility of Economic Measurement. One of the most persistent illusions in American economic policy is the belief that economic phenomena can be measured and quantified like physical objects. Federal agencies produce endless statistics measuring GDP, inflation rates, unemployment levels, and productivity indices, as if these numbers represented objective economic realities rather than arbitrary statistical constructs. Praxeology reveals why this measurement obsession fundamentally misunderstands the nature of economic phenomena. Economic value exists only in the subjective minds of acting individuals and cannot be measured from outside. When you prefer coffee to tea, or when you choose to work overtime instead of leisure, you're making subjective valuations that have no numerical equivalence. Consider the absurdity of measuring gross domestic product as if it represented real economic output. GDP counts government spending equally with private production, treats hurricane destruction as economic growth when reconstruction begins, and ignores the subjective satisfaction that consumers derive from their purchases. A society that spends billions on government bureaucracy shows higher GDP than one where people voluntarily cooperate to meet their needs more efficiently. This statistical illusion leads American policymakers to pursue policies that increase measured GDP while reducing actual human welfare. The impossibility of economic measurement becomes most apparent in socialist calculation. During my debates with socialist economists in the 1920s, they argued that central planners could rationally allocate resources using labor-time calculations or mathematical optimization techniques. But praxeology demonstrates that economic calculation requires market prices, which emerge only from the voluntary exchanges of private property owners. Market prices don't measure objective values, they express the subjective valuations of marginal buyers and sellers at specific moments in time. When wheat trades for $20 per bushel, this doesn't mean wheat is worth $20 in some objective sense. It means that marginal buyers subjectively value that wheat more than $20, while marginal sellers subjectively value $20 more than that wheat. Without private property and voluntary exchange, no numerical calculation can substitute for this market process. Soviet planners could measure tons of steel and acres of wheat, but they couldn't determine whether producing more steel or more wheat would better satisfy consumer preferences. This wasn't a computational problem that better computers might solve, it was a logical impossibility inherent in the nature of subjective value. American economic policy suffers from similar measurement illusions today. The Federal Reserve targets a 2% inflation rate as if this number represented some optimal balance between economic growth and price stability. But inflation is the creation of new money that distorts relative prices throughout the economy. No statistical index can measure the complex ways that monetary expansion redistributes wealth and disrupts market coordination. I invite you to observe how measurement obsessions distort American economic discourse. Politicians debate whether GDP grew by 2.1% or 2.3%, while ignoring whether that growth reflected genuine wealth creation or statistical manipulation. Economists argue about unemployment rates while governments create make-work programs that hide joblessness behind bureaucratic employment. Central bankers target inflation indices while their monetary policies create asset bubbles that devastate middle-class savers. The attempt to quantify inherently qualitative phenomena leads to what I call the pretense of knowledge, the illusion that complex social phenomena can be controlled through numerical manipulation. American policymakers believe they can fine-tune economic performance by adjusting fiscal and monetary variables, like engineers controlling a machine through precise calibration. But markets are not machines, they are spontaneous orders that emerge from the voluntary interactions of countless individuals pursuing their subjective goals. No external measurement can capture the dynamic creativity of entrepreneurial discovery or predict how individuals will respond to changing circumstances. True economic science recognizes the limits of measurement and focuses instead on understanding the logical relationships that govern human action. We cannot measure subjective values, but we can understand how these values manifest in market phenomena like prices, interest rates, and profit margins. This understanding provides genuine knowledge about economic processes without the false precision of mathematical modeling. Chapter 4: Subjective Value Theory versus Objective Delusions. The foundation of all sound economic thinking rests on understanding that value is subjective, existing only in the minds of acting individuals, not in objects themselves. This insight revolutionized economic science and provides the key to understanding why free markets work while all forms of central planning fail. Yet American economic education continues teaching objective theories of value that lead to disastrous policy conclusions. Classical economists like Adam Smith and David Ricardo believed that goods possessed objective values determined by the labor required to produce them. This labor theory of value seemed reasonable. Surely a table that required 10 hours to build was worth twice as much as a chair that required 5 hours. But this thinking confuses production costs with economic value and leads to the socialist fallacy that workers deserve the full value of what they produce. Praxeology reveals that value flows in the opposite direction. Producers invest labor and resources in making tables not because tables possess inherent value, but because consumers subjectively value tables more than the resources required to produce them. If consumer preferences shift away from tables toward modern furniture, those 10 hours of labor create no economic value regardless of the physical effort expended. This subjective understanding explains why socialist economies invariably fail to satisfy consumer needs. Central planners can measure labor hours and material inputs, but they cannot access the subjective valuations that determine whether consumers actually want the goods being produced. Soviet factories might fulfill their quotas by producing millions of shoes, but if consumers preferred different styles or sizes, all that labor was economically wasted. American economic policy suffers from similar objective value delusions. Minimum wage laws assume that labor possesses some objective value that markets fail to recognize. But praxeology demonstrates that wages reflect the subjective valuations of employers and workers in voluntary exchange. A worker earning $8 per hour isn't being exploited, they're receiving compensation that both parties subjectively prefer to their alternatives. When governments mandate $15 minimum wages, they're not correcting market failures, they're preventing voluntary exchanges between employers who subjectively value that labor at less than $15 and workers who subjectively prefer $8 employment to unemployment. The result is predictable: unemployment increases among precisely those workers the policy claimed to help. The subjective theory of value also explains why market prices coordinate economic activity so effectively. Prices don't reflect objective costs or values, they express the subjective marginal evaluations of the least urgent satisfied wants. When coffee prices rise, this signals that marginal consumers value other goods more than coffee at that price level, encouraging coffee producers to expand output and coffee consumers to economize their usage. This price system creates what I call spontaneous order, coordination without central direction. No government bureaucrat needs to calculate how much coffee Americans should drink or how many coffee shops should operate. These decisions emerge automatically from the subjective valuations expressed through voluntary market exchanges. Consider how this applies to contemporary American economic challenges. Housing prices in San Francisco aren't too high in any objective sense. They reflect the subjective valuations of marginal buyers and sellers given existing supply constraints. Rent control laws that attempt to impose affordable rents below market levels don't lower housing costs, they create shortages by preventing the price signals that would encourage construction and discourage consumption. The environmental movement provides another example of objective value confusion. Environmental regulations often impose enormous costs to achieve minimal pollution reductions, ignoring the subjective trade-offs that individuals would make in voluntary markets. A regulation that costs billions to save 10 statistical lives assumes those lives possess infinite objective value, regardless of how the affected individuals might subjectively weigh environmental risks against economic opportunities. Understanding subjective value theory transforms how we evaluate all economic policies. Instead of asking whether policies achieve some objective good like full employment or price stability, we ask whether they enhance or restrict the ability of individuals to pursue their subjective goals through voluntary cooperation. Free markets succeed precisely because they respect subjective value, allowing each individual to pursue their own priorities while benefiting others through voluntary exchange. Central planning fails because no external authority can access or aggregate the countless subjective valuations that guide individual action. This is why capitalism creates prosperity while socialism creates poverty, regardless of the good intentions or technical expertise of central planners. Economic prosperity emerges from respecting individual subjectivity, not from imposing collective objectivity. Chapter 5: The Market Process, Order Without Design. The most remarkable feature of free markets is their ability to coordinate the actions of millions of individuals without any central authority directing the process. This spontaneous order emerges from individual pursuit of subjective goals through voluntary exchange, creating patterns of cooperation that no human mind could consciously design. To understand this process, consider how a simple pencil reaches your hands. The graphite comes from mines in one country, the wood from forests in another, the metal ferrule from mills in a third location, and the rubber eraser from plantations thousands of miles away. Countless individuals cooperated to produce this pencil: miners, loggers, transportation workers, factory operators, wholesalers, and retailers, yet none of them intended to serve your specific need for writing instruments. This coordination happens through the price system, which transmits information about subjective valuations throughout the global economy. When demand for pencils increases, prices rise slightly, signaling profitable opportunities to everyone in the production chain. Graphite miners don't need to know why pencil demand increased, they simply respond to higher graphite prices by expanding production. This is what I call the market process, the dynamic sequence of entrepreneurial adjustments that coordinate production with consumption. American economic policy consistently underestimates this market process, assuming that government direction can improve on spontaneous coordination. Federal agencies attempt to plan everything from healthcare delivery to energy production, believing that conscious design can replace the unconscious wisdom of market forces. But praxeology demonstrates that this planning pretension is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of how complex systems function. The knowledge required for economic coordination exists only in dispersed fragments, scattered among millions of individuals. Each person knows their own circumstances, preferences, and opportunities, but no central authority can collect and process all this information. Even if bureaucrats could gather such data, it would be obsolete before they could act on it, because market conditions change constantly as individuals adapt to new circumstances. I invite you to observe this market process in your daily life. Notice how grocery stores automatically stock the products you want without anyone specifically planning your shopping needs. Observe how restaurants appear in your neighborhood just as local dining preferences evolve. Watch how online retailers develop new services that you didn't know you wanted until they became available. This spontaneous order extends beyond commercial markets to create what we call the extended order of human cooperation. Language develops through voluntary adoption of useful communication patterns. social customs emerge through repeated interactions that prove mutually beneficial. Scientific knowledge advances through the competitive process of hypothesis testing and peer review. But spontaneous order requires specific institutional conditions to function properly. Most importantly, it requires secure private property rights that allow individuals to keep the fruits of their productive efforts. Without property rights, people have no incentive to cooperate productively and no means of engaging in the voluntary exchanges that create market coordination. The market process also requires what I call free pricing, the ability of prices to fluctuate based on changing supply and demand conditions. When governments impose price controls, they disconnect prices from the underlying subjective valuations that prices are supposed to express. This destroys the information system that coordinates economic activity, leading to shortages, surpluses, and systematic misallocation of resources. Consider how American housing markets demonstrate both the power and the fragility of spontaneous order. In cities with relatively free markets like Houston, housing construction automatically adjusts to population growth, keeping prices relatively affordable despite rapid economic expansion. But in cities with extensive zoning laws and development restrictions like San Francisco, government interference prevents this market adjustment, creating housing shortages and extreme price distortions. The COVID-19 pandemic provided another vivid example of market versus government coordination. While government agencies struggled to distribute medical supplies through bureaucratic channels, private companies rapidly converted production lines to manufacture ventilators, masks, and sanitizers wherever demand was highest. Entrepreneurs discovered new ways to deliver goods and services under lockdown conditions, while government programs remained mired in red tape and political considerations. Understanding the market process reveals why socialism inevitably fails regardless of the intelligence or good intentions of central planners. Socialist economies lack the price signals that guide resource allocation in market systems. Without market prices based on private property and voluntary exchange, central planners cannot determine which production methods are economically efficient or which goods consumers actually want. This is not a practical problem that better technology might solve, it is a logical impossibility inherent in the nature of economic calculation and coordination. Chapter 6: Entrepreneurship, the driving force of progress. At the heart of every market economy stands the entrepreneur, the individual who perceives profit opportunities and acts to capture them by better serving consumer needs. Entrepreneurship is not merely business ownership or management, but the uniquely human function of perceiving and correcting market imbalances through creative action. Understanding entrepreneurship reveals why free markets generate continuous innovation and rising living standards, while government planning produces stagnation and decline. The entrepreneur operates in a world of uncertainty, where future conditions cannot be predicted with mathematical precision. Unlike the mechanical decision-makers of economic textbooks, real entrepreneurs must form judgments about consumer preferences, technological possibilities, and competitive responses based on incomplete information. This is what distinguishes entrepreneurship from mere management. The entrepreneurial function involves creating new knowledge about market opportunities, not just efficiently administering existing operations. Consider how American entrepreneurs continuously transform our daily lives through innovations that no government agency could have planned. Steve Jobs didn't conduct market research to discover that consumers wanted smartphones. He perceived an opportunity to integrate existing technologies in ways that would create entirely new categories of consumer value. Jeff Bezos didn't analyze statistics showing demand for online bookstores. He recognized that internet technology could revolutionize retail distribution in ways that traditional businesses hadn't imagined. This entrepreneurial process works through what I call profit and loss signals. When entrepreneurs correctly anticipate consumer preferences and organize production efficiently, they earn profits that reward their successful judgment and provide capital for expansion. When they misjudge market conditions or organize production inefficiently, they suffer losses that redirect resources toward more valued uses. This profit and loss system creates a selection process more rigorous than any government bureaucracy could design. Successful entrepreneurs expand their operations and influence, while unsuccessful ones lose control over scarce resources. No central authority needs to evaluate entrepreneurial performance. The market itself provides immediate feedback through voluntary consumer choices. Government intervention systematically disrupts this entrepreneurial process by distorting the profit and loss signals that guide resource allocation. When officials provide subsidies to favored industries, they enable inefficient producers to survive despite their failure to serve consumer needs effectively. When they impose regulations that limit competition, they protect established businesses from entrepreneurial challenges that would otherwise force innovation and improvement. The Small Business Administration exemplifies this misunderstanding of entrepreneurship. Government officials treat small businesses as if they were merely smaller versions of large corporations, requiring similar paperwork, compliance procedures, and regulatory approvals. But genuine entrepreneurship thrives on flexibility, experimentation, and rapid response to changing market conditions, precisely the qualities that bureaucratic procedures destroy. American tax policy provides another example of anti-entrepreneurial bias. Progressive taxation punishes the successful risk-taking that drives economic progress, while tax deductions and credits favor established industries with political influence. Capital gains taxes discourage the investment that funds entrepreneurial ventures, while corporate welfare programs subsidize politically connected businesses regardless of their market performance. The regulatory state poses perhaps the greatest threat to American entrepreneurship. Every new regulation creates compliance costs that fall disproportionately on small, innovative businesses that lack the resources to navigate complex bureaucratic requirements. Large corporations often support increased regulation precisely because it limits entrepreneurial competition from nimble startups that might disrupt established market positions. Understanding entrepreneurship also reveals why socialist calculation is impossible. Central planners cannot replicate the entrepreneurial function because they lack the profit incentive that motivates accurate judgment about consumer preferences. Government bureaucrats may be intelligent and well-intentioned, but they have no personal stake in accurately anticipating market conditions or organizing production efficiently. Moreover, socialist systems eliminate the competitive process that selects successful entrepreneurs and eliminates unsuccessful ones. When government agencies make economic decisions, there is no market test of their accuracy. Bureaucratic failures may persist for decades because political considerations replace economic accountability. The entrepreneurial process requires what I call economic freedom, the institutional environment that allows individuals to perceive opportunities, organize productive enterprises, and keep the fruits of their successful efforts. This includes secure property rights, enforceable contracts, free pricing, open competition, and minimal regulatory barriers to innovation. American prosperity depends on maintaining and expanding this entrepreneurial environment. Every restriction on economic freedom reduces the scope for entrepreneurial discovery and slows the process of economic progress that has raised living standards throughout our history. The choice facing America is clear: we can preserve the institutional framework that enables entrepreneurial innovation, or we can expand government control that gradually stifles the creative energy that drives economic advancement. Chapter 7: Praxeology as the Foundation of Social Science. The method of praxeology extends beyond economics to provide the logical foundation for understanding all purposeful human behavior. Just as the axiom of human action generates the entire science of economics, it also illuminates the principles that govern political, social, and cultural phenomena. This broader application of praxeological thinking offers Americans a scientific alternative to the ideological confusion that dominates contemporary social discourse. Political science becomes a branch of praxeology when we recognize that government officials, like all humans, act purposefully to achieve their subjective goals. The naive civic textbook assumption that politicians and bureaucrats selflessly serve the public interest dissolves when we apply praxeological analysis to political behavior. Public officials respond to the incentives created by political institutions, not to abstract ideals of social welfare. Consider how this transforms our understanding of American democratic processes. Voters don't make informed decisions about complex policy issues, they make rational choices based on limited information and competing priorities. Politicians don't craft legislation to optimize social outcomes, they build coalitions and distribute benefits to secure electoral support. Bureaucrats don't efficiently implement legislative intentions, they expand their budgets and regulatory authority to enhance their organizational power. This doesn't mean political actors are evil or corrupt, it means they respond predictably to the institutional incentives they face. A praxeological analysis of democracy reveals why government programs consistently grow beyond their intended scope, why regulations multiply regardless of their effectiveness, and why political promises rarely match policy outcomes. The same praxeological principles apply to social and cultural phenomena. Marriage customs, religious practices, and community organizations all emerge from individual choices to cooperate in ways that serve mutual goals. These institutions evolve through voluntary adoption and competitive selection, not through conscious social design. Understanding this evolutionary process helps distinguish between beneficial social changes that emerge spontaneously and harmful disruptions imposed through political force. Educational institutions provide a perfect example of praxeological analysis in action. American public schools perform poorly not because teachers are incompetent or students are lazy, but because the institutional structure removes the competitive pressures that drive improvement in market systems. When schools receive funding regardless of their performance, and when families cannot easily choose alternative providers, educational quality inevitably deteriorates. Praxeology also illuminates the role of ideology in social development. Ideas have consequences because individuals act on their beliefs about how the world works. When Americans embrace sound economic principles based on praxeological understanding, they create policies that enhance prosperity and freedom. When they accept fallacious theories that ignore human nature, they generate interventions that produce unintended consequences and systematic social problems. The current American crisis of institutional trust reflects widespread recognition that expert authorities consistently fail to deliver on their promises. Climate policies that impose enormous costs while achieving minimal environmental benefits. Healthcare regulations that increase costs while reducing access to care. Financial regulations that protect large banks while limiting credit access for small businesses. These failures aren't accidents, they're the predictable result of policies based on non-praxeological thinking that ignores how humans actually behave. I invite you to observe how praxeological analysis clarifies contemporary social controversies. Immigration debates become more rational when we recognize that people migrate to improve their economic circumstances, not to fulfill abstract demographic goals. Urban planning decisions make more sense when we understand that neighborhood development emerges from countless individual choices about where to live and work, not from bureaucratic master plans. The family provides perhaps the most important application of praxeological principles to social organization. Families form through voluntary association based on mutual benefit and emotional satisfaction. Family relationships thrive when they enhance the goals of individual members, and they deteriorate when external pressures or internal conflicts make cooperation costly. Government interventions in family life consistently produce unintended consequences because they ignore these praxeological principles. Welfare policies that penalize marriage and reward single parenthood systematically undermine family formation. Child custody laws that treat parental relationships as bureaucratic procedures rather than voluntary associations damage the emotional bonds that make families function effectively. The scientific status of praxeology stems from its foundation in the undeniable fact of human action. Unlike other social sciences that rely on statistical correlations or cultural assumptions, praxeology derives its conclusions through logical deduction from universal principles of human behavior. This gives praxeological insights the same certainty as mathematical theorems, while maintaining direct relevance to real human problems. American social science desperately needs this praxeological foundation to escape the ideological confusion that currently dominates academic research. Instead of treating human behavior as if it were determined by external forces, praxeology recognizes the creative autonomy that makes genuine social science possible. Instead of seeking to control social outcomes through government intervention, praxeological analysis helps us understand how beneficial social cooperation emerges through voluntary human action. This understanding provides the intellectual tools Americans need to preserve and extend the institutions of freedom that have made our society prosperous and dynamic. Conclusion. The logical structure of human action provides the only reliable foundation for understanding economic and social phenomena. While mathematical economists construct elaborate models that consistently fail to predict market behavior, and while politicians implement policies based on popular delusions about how society works, praxeology offers Americans a scientific method grounded in the undeniable reality of purposeful human action. Every attempt to plan, control, or manipulate human behavior through government intervention violates the basic principles revealed by praxeological analysis. Central planners cannot access the subjective valuations that drive individual action. Bureaucratic regulations cannot improve on the spontaneous coordination achieved through voluntary exchange. Political authorities cannot create prosperity by redistributing wealth or controlling prices. The choice facing America is fundamental. We can embrace the scientific understanding of human action that leads to freedom and prosperity, or we can continue pursuing policies based on theoretical delusions that inevitably produce the opposite of their stated goals. Praxeology doesn't offer easy answers or quick fixes. It reveals the logical constraints that govern all social cooperation and the institutional requirements for sustainable human flourishing. The truth about human action cannot be suppressed indefinitely by political authority or academic fashion. Eventually, reality asserts itself over ideology, and sound principles triumph over popular errors. Those who understand praxeological principles today are preparing for a future where economic science replaces political manipulation as the foundation of social policy.